That rule referred specifically to the mining and processing machines. Since each machine, in a sense, would be contractually obligated to produce a certain amount of helium-3 for an operating fusion power plant here on Earth. You have to have those fusion power plants conceptually demonstrated before you're ever going to start to really put mining machines on the moon. But once you start to do that, the contractual obligation means that you want to minimize the risk of a miner shutting down and not being able to meet its contractual obligations. And so if you think of it this way, you've got a mining machine operating on the moon, probably with a crew of 2 that is acting to oversee that operation at any given time. There'll be continuous miners. And then you have a failure. Well, you want that failure to not affect that continuous operation, automatic operation. And then if you have a second failure, you want to be able for that crew to operate the machine manually. So again, you're not reducing the rate at which you're producing helium-3. And then in the final level, if you have a fourth failure, then you want the machine to shut down and safe itself so that you can repair it. But you also, having said all that, at any given time, you want to be able, while the machine's operating, you want to be able to repair, you want to be able to replace parts that need to be replaced because they're just aging. You want what you call embedded diagnostics so that you can continually monitor the critical parts of the machine and so forth. So you look at a machine that's going to just be up there operating indefinitely, and for space, that's a new engineering concept. We did not build a space station, for example, to last indefinitely. We should have. We should have exercised these conceptual engineering concepts of indefinite life with the space station, but we did not. And so someday, it may be 2020, it may turn out 2025, the space station is going to re-enter the atmosphere, and it's just not going to be functional anymore. Whereas when you're talking about mining operations on the moon, you want these miners to operate essentially indefinitely.
In the United States, we tend to be a now culture. We are focused on the now, and it's very difficult for many people to look out into the future 20, 30 years, or 40 years, or even 50 years. And I notice in your book you use 2050 as a benchmark a lot, like there's a concern for meeting some timeline of 2050. Is there a particular reason it's 2050? Is it population-oriented, or where did you get that number?
Well, it is a figure that has been used and was being used around the turn of this century as a benchmark for how much energy the population at that time, if it stabilized at about 10 to 12 billion people on the planet, how much energy they would need just to subsist, and then how much more energy would be required to meet their aspirations. And so it's a convenient mid-century number. It's arbitrary. You can pick almost any number. It's just one that people have often used, and you can find statistical data to around that number to support your arguments.
You also said that there are organizational approach options for a return to the moon, and you mentioned 6 of them. U.S. only, multilateral but led by the USA, Intelstat model, encompassing the 1979 Moon Agreement, private/U.S. government partnerships, and private/government-funded Lunar RDT&E, and then all private. And I'm wondering, what are you going for? What do you think is the best for the situation that really deals with what we have to do?
Well, based on the analysis I did in that chapter, and had done some time prior to that, and just updated, I think from a cost point of view and a high probability of success point of view, that the all private is much preferable. Now, when we say all private, you of course realize that the government, if it's a United States entity that's undertaking this, that the United States government will be a player. It's a player in terms of taxation. It's a player in terms of regulation. The law requires that launch vehicles be approved, pass muster, and that now the law actually requires also that whatever you bring back to Earth has to be meet certain regulatory criteria. So the government's a player.
Who authorizes that? Who has to approve it?
Right now, it's the Department of Transportation, I think, is the main regulatory player in all of that. Well, of course, the Congress and whatever levels of corporate taxation they decide on, that's a player as well. That's part of your cost. And also, I think the United States government would have to be sympathetic to the enterprise. They have to be your supporter in international fora. There are people who, in other countries, who interpret the Moon Treaty of 1967, not the Moon Treaty, but the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, as not authorizing an enterprise of the kind I describe in the book Return to the Moon. I think that's an erroneous, and I think it's a politically motivated interpretation, but nevertheless, the United States would have to be your supporter in that indeed a properly licensed entity could go to the Moon, extract the helium-3 resources, and bring them back to Earth for commercial operations. I think the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 clearly makes that possible and should be interpreted in that way. But if the United States government decides to go the other direction, well, then you're pretty much dead in the water. So the government's a player, no question about it. Financially, you would like to do it with investors.
And you talked about a need for a new treaty. How would that happen?
Well, I don't think you need a new treaty.
Really?
I think the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 is perfectly adequate for
it has enough protections.
With this kind of an operation, as it involves the United States and its entrepreneurs. The one thing that might be helpful would be at least a multilateral agreement to recognize a certain what we would call a claims regime on the Moon, so that claims would a set of mining claims under certain constraints of size and time and implementation, that those claims would effectively be negotiable private property. That would certainly, I think, help in attracting future investors to this enterprise, and certainly would give a entity that's developing a settlement a way to reward their settlers with grants of land and that kind of thing. And that, though I don't think needs to be a full-fledged international treaty, it can be done by multilateral agreements between players that are actually going to go to the Moon.
That's great. On page 300 of your book, you talked about humans versus robots in space, and a lot of people think just send robots up there. You don't need to send humans up there. I thought it was interesting that you said there's a huge amount of evidence from the Apollo work that the economic costs of robots are very prohibitive. With nanotechnology moving as fast as it is, do you think that nanotechnology could play a role in the robotics up there, or no?
Oh, technology will play a role. You need to be using robotics. In fact, that is as I indicated earlier, that's the big challenge, I think, economic challenge of building these miners, is that they basically work in a largely automated way and continuously. But I am not yet of the opinion that they can be repaired and monitored without humans present on the spot. And I think it's going to turn out to be much more efficient to have humans in that capacity on the miners, associated with the miners, than it would be to try to operate everything remotely from the Earth. I just can't yet. Maybe it's my age, but I can't yet imagine that happening, and that having as small a crew of people involved on the moon as possible is important.